This is going to be a rather short video. We're going to take a look at the launch of Grok 4.5, see how it stacks up to competitors like Claude, GPT, and open source models. And at the end, I'm also going to give my opinion on how I think SpaceXAI, which is the new name, is going to perform moving forwards. This is the blog post announcing the model. We can see that they're using their new name since XAI was merged into SpaceX earlier this year, and SpaceX is now a public company. They're also claiming that this is their strongest model ever and that it was trained alongside Cursor. Cursor is an AI coding tool that was acquired by XAI this year for an eye-watering sum, and they have a lot of experience when it comes to training their own models. For example, I have here their blog post introducing Composer 2.5. This is from May 18th, and this was their own model series. And at that point, Opus 4.7 was the best performing model, but Composer 2.5 had comparable results at a much lower price. And even though this was not disclosed, people found out that Composer was trained on top of the open source Kimi model. This was because they left an artifact in their code that referenced back to Kimi, but also because the tokenizer was exactly the same, so this was a telltale sign. But now they're using the same data to train Grok 4.5, which is arguably a much better base model. Cursor is so popular, and the data they're able to collect from developers using their app is really invaluable to Grok, which has generally lagged behind other models in terms of its coding abilities. That edge is evident on the benchmarks. Grok 4.5 outperforms Opus 4.8 on most of them, including Deep SWE here, also SWE Marathon over here, and Terminal Bench 2.1 over here. If we go back to Deep SWE, we'll see that it doesn't quite reach the performance of Fable or GPT 5.5, but when we look later at pricing, we'll understand why. Before we move on, I would like to add a side note on the benchmarks. Deep SWE is a new one that was released by a company called DataCurve, but Terminal Bench and SWE Bench Pro have been around for over a year. My opinion on benchmarks is that as soon as they're released publicly, they become much less reliable. That is because if an AI lab has access to the test cases that are used in a benchmark, it can train its AI model to be very good at these specific test cases, but then that performance is not going to generalize to other real-world tasks. That problem is called contamination, and I'm voicing this concern here specifically because Deep SWE was released after Opus 4.8, but before Grok 4.5, and that could give the opportunity to XAI to do this, either intentionally or unintentionally. But it's not apparent that this is the case because on the same benchmark, Grok 4.5 ranks less than GPT 5.5, which has been around for a couple of months now. But at the end of the day, you never know. Continuing down the blog post, there's a section where SpaceXAI brags about how many GPUs they have. We already know that they have some of the biggest clusters, so this is not really that interesting. Then they showcase an app that was built using Grok 4.5. This also doesn't really tell us anything because it's just one prompt and we can't really compare it to other models, but nonetheless, it's a cool app. This is one of the more interesting sections, and it describes how Grok improved their token efficiency. A big issue with frontier models in general is that they're very verbose, especially with the intermediary thinking tokens, and because you're being billed per token, that tends to skyrocket costs. So Grok 4.5 takes 4.2 times less tokens to solve the same problem as Opus 4.8, and that means lower costs and faster responses. They've also been able to host this model at 80 tokens per second, which means even faster responses. Then they note that Grok 4.5 is now the default model in Grok Build, which in my experience nobody uses. It's a competitor to Codex or Claude Code, but it's only available through a command line interface. I think most people who are going to try out Grok 4.5 are going to do so through the Cursor app instead. They also talk about their Word, PowerPoint, and Excel integrations. Even though most labs have such extensions, we don't have any benchmarks for them, so it's very hard to draw an accurate comparison here. Lastly, on cost, Grok 4.5 is priced at 2 to 5 times less compared to other frontier models in terms of cost per token. And because it outputs 4 times less tokens, as we saw just a couple of minutes ago, the savings increase to being about 10 times cheaper than other frontier models. There is an asterisk on these figures though, because if you're using, say, Claude Opus through Claude Code, the cost is heavily subsidized, and it's the same with the GPT models through Codex. So the savings will only really apply if you're using these models through an API. So overall, Grok 4.5 is positioned to be a cheaper and faster alternative while still being comparable in terms of performance to other frontier models. I think it might also steal market share from open source models like Kimi that we already mentioned, or GLM, that are currently the cheapest and fastest, but lack a little bit on performance. This seems to be a great first model from the SpaceXAI and Cursor partnership, and I think that definitely by the end of the year, they're going to release a much stronger and much more expensive model now that they have access to talent, tons of compute from SpaceX, as well as a lot of training data from Cursor. Another thing they can do to distinguish themselves from the competition is let us fine-tune these models using our own data, and that way businesses can better adapt them to their use cases. OpenAI used to let us do this, but they sunsetted the feature earlier this year, which is very unfortunate. Lastly, if you're looking to implement AI in your business, use the link in the video description to book a call with us.